this special author event brought to you by United States Heartland China Association. My name is Min Fan. I'm the Executive Director of the U.S. Heartland China Association. I'm really honored to bring to you our strategic advisor, professor at University of Denver, and many other folks know very well, Dr. Suisheng Zhao. I have to say that Dr. Suisheng Zhao have a slight connection in the past because we both attended Peking University, but he has accomplished much more. So today, without further ado, I want to let him do all the talking about his new book, The Dragon Roars Back, and Transformational Leaders and Dynamics of Chinese Foreign Policy. So Professor Zhao, all ears are on you, and please bring up your book and share with us the insights and perspective from your book. We'll wait for your slide to be ready.
Okay, thank you, Min Fan and the U.S. Heartland Association, Heartland China Association, for all the wonderful works you have done to promote U.S. China people-to-people relationship. It's very important work you have done. I admire your work very, very much. And also thank you for hosting this book talk on my newly published book. And this book is tries to trace the trajectory of China's rise and the forces driven that rise to the current stage. And people always ask me why I write this book. There are two motivations. One is theoretical, the other is empirical. Empirically, I have not seen a historically in-depth and comprehensive and up-to-date and covering all issue areas and bilateral and multilateral relationships, and try to have a coherent theoretical approach and to study Chinese foreign policy, because I taught that class, have been taught that class for many years. Theoretically, I have found the current theories are not sufficient to help understand China's international behavior. The most often used theory to explain China's international behavior has been so-called structural realism, which focuses on China's relative power and argues that as China's relative power expands, its ambition expands, and a more powerful China would inevitably become an anti-statical power. In other words, some kind of expansionist power to redefine its national interests and intensify territorial disputes and challenge the U.S. Dominant power position. But China's foreign policy has changed over the last 17 years. In fact, when Mao Zedong was the leader of China, China's relative power was very weak. Mao took very confrontational position in the Chinese foreign policy against all the hostile powers. From this table, you can see China fought 6 wars during those years against both superpowers, India and other countries. During the Korean War, China was really not in a position, so-called power position, to fight. And many those in America did not think China was going to fight, but China did it, and did not lose, but neither win. But that shows a relative power cannot explain that. When Deng Xiaoping came to power, China's relative power did not change that much, but China's Deng Xiaoping moderated Chinese foreign policy. And his successors, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, continued the moderation. When China's powers rose significantly and was regarded as a rising power, They advocated so-called peaceful rise. And China fought only 3 wars on their watch. Xi Jinping now has intensified China's tensions with US and many neighbors, many other countries, while China's economy growth has slowed down. Many people have argued, in fact, my former advisor, Sun Shek, wrote a book arguing that China overplayed its hands because its relative power does not support that type of foreign policy. Another theory used to explain China's international behavior, so-called regime type theory, which attributes China's aggressive behavior to its so-called authoritarian system. Only regime change can change China's international behavior, foreign policy. But China's authoritarian system has not changed. Chinese foreign policy has experienced many turns and shifts in the last 70 years. So I would argue that the Chinese foreign policy change is a multi-level and complex process. So my book developed what I called leadership-centered framework and argued that leaders matter in all political systems, but matter more in totalitarian and authoritarian systems than in democracies. Those elect leaders in democracies are constrained by oppositional parties, term limits, public opinions. But the leaders, paramount leaders in the PRC's one-party system, which emphasizes hierarchy and discipline, operate relatively unchecked by public opinion. And there is no oppositional party. And very often those top leaders, most powerful leaders, have held lifetime tenure in power. And but there's a puzzle here. That is, not every paramount leader in the PRC has used that power to chart new course of Chinese foreign policy. So to resolve this puzzle, my book distinguished 3 types of leaders in China. One type is what I called, you can see from the slide, transformational leaders. These are game changers. They have new visions and also political wisdom to navigate through the jungle of power politics in the PRC. And they are also able to mobilize ideological and ideational, what I call ideational resources and institutional resources to advance their policy agenda. It's clearly 3 leaders stand up. Mao Zedong, he started so-called revolutionary policy, which made China stand up. That's what the official language in China. And Deng Xiaoping had what I called a developmental foreign policy, made China rich. And Xi Jinping now has a so-called big power foreign policy, which is going to make China strong. And the second type is, I put them in the bottom, transactional leaders. These leaders managed to survive the power jungle in PRC, but they stay on course set by their predecessors. Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao are clearly transactional leaders. They did not have those new visions and followed the course set by Deng Xiaoping. Then the third type are those failed leaders, 3 in the PRC history, the top paramount leader, Hua Guofeng, Hu Yaobang, and Zhao Ziyang. And these leaders lost power in the jungle. And it doesn't matter if they have new visions or not, who cares in that case. So my book then documented how these 3 transformational leaders each chart new course for China's foreign policy. Here is this so-called leadership centered network. They have new visions. You can see they have those power, charismatic or personal or institutional power, and then they can construct an ideational environment and use political intuitions and exploit international distribution of power and international norms, institutions, and regimes to advance their power. And so the book look at all the focus on the three leaders. Let's talk each of these three leaders about their visions and wisdom and the resources mobilization. First, Mao Zedong. What is Mao Zedong's vision here? He emphasized that PRC was born in an era of imperialism. The themes of the time were war and revolution. Why? Because when imperialism existed, war was inevitable and would lead to revolution. So he also downplayed the imperialist powers and nuclear powers as the paper tigers, famous know. And Mao never hesitated to confront hostile foreign powers, although China's relative power was weak. So the leader here was vision prevailed. His political power and wisdom was very clear. He had established his personal charisma as the founding father of the PRC. And in fact, he held the power lifetime. Mao did not tolerate any comrades daring to challenge his power, authority, and policy, and purge them accordingly. Ruthlessly, in fact. Then he mobilized the national sources. My book exploit two sets of ideational sources. One is historical memories, and the other is nationalist aspirations. And transnational leaders have selectively remembered and drawn historical lessons from the shared, sharply contrasting experiences of pronounced glory of imperial China and also so-called the drama of modern humiliation. Mao Zedong focused on the century of humiliation and built a nationalist credential and set the course for confrontational policy against imperial hostile powers. And also this vision and this historical memory helped him to conduct so-called self-reliance to make China completely independent, so that no external powers could humiliate China again. And his attitude toward imperial China was kind of vague, ambivalent, because imperial China left a lot of legacies difficult at that time to deal with. And also Mao's revolutionary foreign policy was wrapped with a communist internationalism. But Mao was not communist internationalist. He was a nationalist. He followed both communist internationalism and nationalism when they are not in conflict. And but if they are in conflict, Mao chose nationalism. So that's why he not dared to confront both the US and the Soviet Union at that time simultaneously. And internal sources, Mao was a crusader, was making strategic policy alone, never hesitate to confront those institutional, bureaucratic constraints. He delegated authorities to deal with bureaucrats to his trusted Lieutenant, Zhou Enlai Premier. And in terms of his internationally, Mao was a shrewd strategist, and he took advantage of the heightened bipolar rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. He made flexible alignments to reduce security threat. He aligned with the Soviet Union against United States, then tried to play the US against the Soviet Union. And in terms of international norms and regimes, because China was included at that time from UN system, so he was discontent, tried to overthrow the US net order. So China was confrontational. Now, let's look at Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping's vision was totally different from Mao Zedong. He no longer thought the war and the revolution was inevitable. In fact, he thought peace and development was the themes of the time. He opened up China to the outside world, and his foreign policy was to create a peaceful international and regional environment for China's economic modernization. So clear. And his political power wisdom was also unique. Deng was a pragmatic, what I call the strong man. He never held the top party or government positions, but he placed his proteges at the party and the government top positions, and he pulled the string behind them. And ideational sources, Deng Xiaoping changed the narrative, historical narrative of China, although he still talk about humiliation, but he developed a new historical narrative that China had been strong when it was open, and draw deep into the achievements of other peoples. When China closed itself, it fell behind. Then attributed the national humiliation to China lack of development, and popularized the famous historical lesson that the backward will be beaten. And then also used nationalism, but his nationalism was affirmative on the inclusive and positive us to support his developmental policy. And Deng Xiaoping, in terms of institutional building, he was a consensus builder, and then delegated power to the bureaucrats to make routine decisions. He ratified their decisions if they can reach consensus. He stepped in only if they cannot reach consensus. So it's what the scholars call the delegation by consensus. His international position then played the game of the strategic triangle between China, the US, and the Soviet Union very well. Took so-called pivotal position in a power balance game, and China acted as a much coveted balancing third force. Then after end of Cold War, China was in a very difficult position. He formulated so-called no profile foreign policy to buy China's time. And then his successors continued his policy to have a so-called peaceful rise, the harmonious world, all those new concepts. China benefited enormously eventually from the international order and became a so-called stakeholder in the international system. And now, Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping develops totally different version from Deng Xiaoping and also from Mao Zedong. He proposed the China dream of the great rejuvenation, 伟大复兴, and to recapture China's lost global power positions. And also he declared profound change unseen in the century 百年这个大变局 in Chinese word is that in which the East is rising and the West is in declining. So that created the opportunity for China's inevitable rise and political power. Xi Jinping quickly consolidated and centralized his power. And I forgot the additional sources. And in terms of historical memory, Xi Jinping still talk about humiliation, and but he has moved Mao thought to celebrate China's imperial glory to both nationalist pride, and what he has celebrated is kind of imagined or reinvention of imperial China as a benign power center of the world, in fact, center of Asia. His nationalism was different from Deng Xiaoping, Hu Jintao, and Jiang Zemin's nationalism, because that nationalism was affirmative on a positive us. And Xi Jinping, his nationalism has moved beyond that to emphasize, to target on evil and negative other. Here we are talking about Western powers and values. And so it's a somehow different type that is behind China's foreign policy change. In that case, institutional source. Xi Jinping has emphasized the proposed so-called top-level design, 顶层设计, and re-centralized the policy-making authorities to the party center with himself as the core. And in the process, he centralized those coordination institutions, strengthened, and set up a lot of leadership small groups with himself as a head to cut through bureaucratic roadblocks. And in this process, he has emphasized political loyalty of the Chinese diplomats and the Chinese officials to the party and to himself, rather than professionalism. That's what Deng Xiaoping's time. This has changed dramatically, which also changed the incentive structure of Chinese diplomats, Chinese officials. And so he expanded also party diplomacy to tell China's story. And he also tightened the military diplomacy, which in my book discussed in great detail. So Xi Jinping has become a chairman of everything almost. And then come to his international position, international sources. Of course, clearly Xi Jinping has abandoned Deng Xiaoping's low-profile foreign policy and developmental moderation to proactively shape China's international environment rather than passively react to it. And Xi Jinping has emphasized fighting spirit and baseline thinking and set red lines to tell what you cannot cross. Xi Jinping had in relationship with the United States, Xi Jinping has requested or demanded the US to respect China's core national interests. What are core interests, which are what my definition is bottom line of the state survival? You cannot compromise, you cannot negotiate. So those core interests become really something Xi Jinping has insisted in the relationship with US and other countries. And Xi Jinping has changed US net order as unfair and unreasonable enough to reflect interests and values of emerging powers, in this case, China. And China has become a revisionist power demanding the reform of the international order. And Xi Jinping launched a lot of new initiatives, such as One Belt, One Road, and built a coalition of anti-hegemony between China, Russia, and Iran. Iranian president just visited China just last week, and Xi Jinping is going to return the visit to Iran. She is going to visit Russia also in the spring. And these countries, I don't think they share ideology. They share the grievance against US dominance. So in conclusion, I think I try to end in 20 minutes. And in conclusion, let me ask 3 questions here. Whether Xi Jinping, Xi's big power foreign policy is premature, and whether China has overreached, and if Xi Jinping has made China's future increasingly uncertain. I don't know what is your answer to all these questions. My answer is positive, yes. Why? Let me very briefly mention that. First, she is not like Mao Zedong as a shrewd strategist. Xi's power projection has alienated would-be valued partners and united rivals, the US, for example, European countries, Japan, South Korea, those countries, Australia. And he has criticized the US for seeking contain China, but his foreign policy, in fact, met US, you can see the bipartisan support on the China policy, which, and also the efforts US to build those coalitions of like-minded countries. Although he tried to reform the international order, but the world has not come to the China's direction because China does not have enough resources to provide public goods, and China does not have the universal values that are accepted by those other countries. And second, Xi Jinping policy has expedited China's economic slowdown. When the 20th Party Congress was closed, you see the Hong Kong, when the new leadership declared, you see the Hong Kong stock market and the world stock market, China now, and other people try to get out of China, investors try to get to China. The most famous term in China is run out of China for those rich people and those who can get out of China. Third, but finally, third and most importantly, Xi Jinping does not have Mao Zedong's charisma, and people obey to him primarily because of their fear for his power. So Xi has surrounded himself with so-called lawyers, especially at the 20th Party Congress, and it's so clear. Those who dare to criticize Xi's policy or tell him the unpleasant truths has been labeled as Wang Yi Zongyang, arbitrarily commenting against the center. And now it's getting more personal, maliciously slandering party and state leader, 恶意诽谤、恶意诋毁党和国家领导人. So this type of personalized foreign policy making has minimized the opportunity for his wrong decisions to be credited, and make Chinese foreign policy very often incoherent, unpredictable. So what we see, zero COVID policy, and its U-turn is a very good example. So Xi's power concentration in this case has plunged China into a vicious cycle. As a very powerful leader, he could make mistakes because nobody would tell him the truth. And the consequences would be dire and lead to more mistakes, increasing the possibility of intended or unintended consequence of foreign policy of no return. So in that case, for example, if Xi Jinping decided to use force against Taiwan, I don't think anyone will stop him or can stop him. So China has come to a very uncertain future. I'll stop here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Zhao, for the presentation. I will ask the question. We had lots of questions pre-submitted. I will also invite actually our team. I believe Jason and Alan also have questions. So my first question is, as I mentioned, I recently was in China, and I noticed in the Chinese hotels, you can find She's Thoughts books, but it's pretty thick. So I actually didn't try to read it. But in the Western world, as you know, I feel like China feel misunderstood. Part of it, maybe people don't understand Xi's unique position. But I don't know how many people, other than Kevin Rudd, maybe have read that book, right? I think your book has generated quite a stir in this very interesting time, because people are trying to figure out what is really, what will work, what theory will help guide us towards a better outcome. So do you think maybe people in US should really devote time to study Xi Jinping's thought to better understand this transformational leader, because he's going to be calling the shots?
I don't know if all the Chinese people have read that thick book. They just read those abstracts or summaries most often. And it will be very difficult for Americans or for anyone other than those in China to understand China's those China Taohua, those jargons and slogans, all those things. But you're right. The Western scholars and policymakers should understand Xi Jinping and what he's thinking about China's future, and about China's policies domestically and internally. But it's not easy now. The communication between these two countries have been somehow, I think, minimum. And even if those Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, before his meeting with Wang Yi later this week, if he read those books, I don't think that will help. They really have to communicate now, I think, between these two countries and leaders. The communication channels before Trump time was locked. There were so many hundreds of communication channels. How many left now? Almost nothing. And the summit meeting between President Xi Jinping and Joe Biden last November produced Blinken's visit, but the balloon incident postponed the visit. I'm glad that they are going to meet in Munich this week, and but more of those kind of communications and also more institutionalized dialogues should be restored. So those are the first step. And also people-to-people like communications, exchanges like what you do, I think, are extremely important. And this type of exchanges and cooperation now has been also in a very difficult situation because of both sides. And even for those scholarly exchanges, we still have a lot of Chinese scholars, Chinese students coming to the US. How many of American students and scholars are in China? You were in China, you were brave, but I don't know how many American scholars now dare to go to there at this time. Now, gradually, I think some of them going to be there, but during the 3 years of pandemic, almost zero. CSIS got the Kennedy went to China, became a star. That was ironic.
Well, actually, I'll make a quick comment, then we'll turn to maybe Alan and Jason ask a question. I think there are questions coming from the audience, fast and furious. So when I was in China, people are saying, how is it America still safe to go? They are reading about all the situation. But before I went to China, my friends said, oh, you're going to disaster zone. Honestly, I was zipping around the fast train. Everything seemed to be, again, I wasn't near the hospital that much. Everything seemed to be coming back quite normal. But again, people, after 3 years, a lot of concern and fear. Next, let's see. Alan, would you like to ask a question for Professor Zhao? Unmute yourself, please.
Sure. I have a copy of your book right here, and I just wanted to say that I found it incredibly compelling and very, very well researched. My question for you this evening is, in your book, you discuss state-led popular nationalism under the leadership of Xi Jinping, and how much of it is backed by performance legitimacy. In the wake of China's slowing economy after decades of exponential growth, what do you see sustaining such nationalism in the future? And to tie it back to foreign policy, given the linkages between nationalism and foreign policy, how do you see this impacting it going forward?
Before Xi Jinping's time, Chinese nationalism was driven by two forces from two directions. One is a bottom-up, what I call the popular nationalism, which has defined the nation as composed of individual citizens. So they want to have their citizen rights in the nation, but also they defend the national rights, state rights in the international arena. In that case, they were much more vocal and emotional than the state to criticize foreign evil intentions. The state nationalism was top-down, led by the state. And because at that time, Deng Xiaoping had a so-called no-profile foreign policy. So the state nationalism has two phases. On the one hand, they tried to be to defend and crit Chinese interests against foreign powers, but on the other hand, tried to be very pragmatic to prevent those criticism turn into the fire against the state policy of no profile. So they tried to constrain or channel what they call the yindao, the popular nationalism, to the Chinese official foreign policy. So because the popular nationalism in that case was a double-edged sword. Since Xi Jinping came to office, he has led what you mentioned, that the convergence between popular and state nationalism, because he changed Deng Xiaoping's no-profile foreign policy, advocated a big power diplomacy, which resonated the popular demands. So that became a state-led popular nationalism, which could not tolerate any criticism of the Chinese regime and policy. And in that case, what I call the transformation from affirmative nationalism to assertive nationalism nationalism on the Western powers. And there's a new generation of the Chinese nationalists emerged in the last 20 decades. And they were educated on the so-called patriotic education campaign, and they experienced China's rise, rapid economic growth, was so proud of China's accomplishments. And so they became strong supporters of the state nationalism and Xi Jinping's policy. But the COVID zero policy had changed a lot in the last several months. You can see those from last November and on the streets, those young people, they are young people. They were previously known as a little pink, the little pinks, but now they suffered. And I think a lot of their mind has changed. And I don't know how much they will still in a similar position to support the government policy. In fact, my sense, they lost a lot of trust because of the zero COVID and U-turn. And now there's the economic suffering, and youth, 20% could not find jobs. That's something really scary. For if I were in Xi Jinping's position, I would really be concerned about China. So how much they will continue to be that type of assertive, competitive nationalists, we have to wait and see.
Thank you. Maybe Jason, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Dr. Zhao. And I know we've received some audience questions about COVID policy, and we'll go to audience questions here in a moment, I believe. But selfishly, I'm curious. So listening to you talk tonight about the history between Russia and China and how Mao Zedong was able to position China's rise in between the conflict between the USSR and US back during the Cold War. And I was interested in your book how you also mentioned China's current Jiangxilai and how it's allying itself with more countries like Iran and Russia in sort of a opposition to America's global, or I believe you used the word anti-hegemonic powers. So I'm kind of curious about how you foresee China's position in global politics in upcoming years, particularly if Russia is as strong of an ally or pseudo-ally in your book, I believe you used the word. Will Xi Jinping continue to distance himself from Moscow, or if these anti-hegemonic powers are so important to China's rise, what direction do you see foreign policy taking for China in the near future?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Mao Zedong was a true strategist, planning the game or flexible alignment game really well. Both superpowers took Mao and took China seriously because they were not sure if China would be with them, because China just defected quickly. China was an ally of the Soviet Union, but then they split with the Soviet Union and confronted the Soviet Union, and then same allied with the United States. In that case, US was not sure if China would not defect toward the Soviet Union. In fact, it did try to, in the 1970s and 80s, China tried to build a very good relationship with Soviet Union and also with the United States. So some people call it romantic triangle. China was in a pivotal position, and the Soviet Union and the US was fighting. China tried to benefit from their fights and had tried to build a good relationship with both the Soviet Union and the United States in the early 1980s. So that was a very smart strategic move. But I don't know if current Chinese leaders understand that kind of strategic dynamics, because Mao Zedong knew China's power was relatively weak. So he had to be flexible to take advantage of those international interactions to position China, although from weak position, but in indispensable position. But nowadays, the world has changed dramatically. Although the strategic triangle is still there, but China has in a very difficult position with the United States since the Trump administration, which is not naturally China's fault. I mean, partially China's fault, but also partially problems in the US. And in the meantime, China tries to, in this kind of confrontational relationship, as you said, China has tried to build what Brzezinski in 1990s called anti-hegemony coalition. Here we see China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, maybe Pakistan now changed also, and maybe North Korea, those countries. But what they shared, as I said, not they have the same ideology or some really long-lasting economic complementary interests, but shared grievances against the United States. But the problem now for China is that China is pretty much maybe I should not say isolated in the world stage, because Russia is not some country, many countries want to be friends with. And Russia's power from the war in Ukraine, we can see it's not as we thought. And so you said China tried to somehow keep a distance from Russia, which I think that would be a good position, try to position itself has some to maintain relationship with Russia, but to improve, to use those as a leverage to improve relationship with the Western countries. But I have not seen that at this time. That's what a lot of people in the US now are debating. President Xi Jinping has softened his tone since the meeting with Biden. But what we have seen, and people ask if this is tactical or fundamental. I don't know. From what I see now, we got Iran's president visit. Xi Jinping himself is going to visit Russia. And when the balloon event took place, China at first tried to say regret, but now they've quickly tried to make up a lot of other stories. And so it's a really delicate, I would say, China foreign policy. I don't know what direction China will move from here.
Thank you. There are tons of questions. I'm sure, Professor Zhao, you haven't had time to read. I'm going to pick one from Paul Burke. Meanwhile, Jason, I know if you have any special guests who want to come on camera, please do. So Paul Burke's question is actually very close to the area we do. He talked about before he left to become foreign minister, Ambassador Qin Gang and his staff had made a clear outreach to the heartland. For example, my organization and our nonprofit, which is involving agriculture. How sincere are these outreaches in terms of really renewing friendly relation? I love to hear your response, and I can share our perspective as well.
Of course, I know you have your own perspective. I hope my perspective will be close to yours. I think Qin Gang was a very seasoned diplomat and very competent. That's why he has become the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He did a marvelous job as an ambassador to the US, both to promote government-to-government relationship, which was very difficult during his tenure. So he also spent so much time to promote people-to-people relationship. In fact, Fanming, I'm so grateful and congratulate you for what you have done working with him in that U.S. China Agriculture Summit in Iowa. I think it was a great event and a contribution your organization has made to the U.S. China relationship. And also he was part of that dialogue. You can see he performed really well. So I don't know now, he was a competent ambassador, but how would he be a minister of foreign affairs? That's everyone's guess, because the Chinese system. Give example, when Yang Jiechi was foreign minister, he was very professional. People talked to him, spoke so good English, and good friend of Bush family, Little Tiger, those kind of nicknames, very professional. And Wang Yi, when he was foreign minister under Hu Jintao, he was also very professional. But then in the last several years, we see the change. They become a warrior diplomats, warriors, because of the policy change in China, because of the positions required, their behavior. For many years, Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs was criticized by the Chinese public as a lack of the bone. So they sent them calcium tablets. But now, Ministry of Foreign Affairs is known as the Ministry of Warrior Ministry. They recast themselves. So I don't know in that context, Qin Gang, when he went back to China as foreign minister, what his performance we have to see. What do you think?
Well, I definitely think from our interaction in Iowa, again, there was a lack of people-to-people exchanges. So him personally being in Heartland actually broke ice. He took courage because folks were really moved that he and his wife, were mingling, and he definitely enjoyed the break from Washington, D.C. But one telling point came because after the Iowa event, which you attended in person, thank you for traveling to it, we got a call from friends in St. Louis. They said, oh, Qinggang visited Iowa and the sky didn't fall. Do you think we could invite him to St. Louis? That tells you how nervous, how strange the relationship has become. And later when he went to St. Louis, remember he hit the first ball at the Cardinals game, and within 2 hours it was on CCTV, so we know he's very special. But that we were very nervous because we didn't know if people will boo him, right? Here's a Chinese ambassador walking on in the state of Jeff Hawley, he's going to walk on the Cardinals game. And we were really nervous, but people applauded. And he, again, he put himself out there. And as China is not, Chinese people not this evil with all the anti-Asian and the Chinese hate, I think he took courage. And in that interaction, I felt, and also he and Ambassador Byrne had a really good kind of Twitter. And I felt that diplomats are really on both sides trying really hard to keep degrees of freedom in the open space. So I'm hopeful because he is a talent, and the fact that he rose, I think he deserved it. But I will please another question.
One sentence there. He could travel all over the United States. I hope China will not allow Nick Burns to the same.
Yes, we heard from that. Of course, we're told that was when quarantine was happening. So we'll see how things are now. It's now. Do you like to pick any question? Let's see. There are a lot about. I think if you see any friends asking questions, and if you here's one from Susan Thornton, our board member. Thanks to Suisheng Zhao and USHCA for this great talk. Sam, you paint a kind of a grim picture for China's future, but it seems that US leaders see China as a threatening juggernaut that wants to replace the US as the world leader. If China's future is so uncertain, do you think that if things take a turn for the worse, will Xi and China lash out and possibly be even more aggressive? How much does Xi control the PLA, and what is the propensity for him to turn to military force in various scenarios? How can we avoid conflict?
Susan, thank you. Is Susan Stanton there? No.
Yes, if Susan wants to join on camera, please do.
I admire her work so much, and she has been very eloquent talking about U.S.-China relationship. And I don't know. I mean, Xi Jinping himself said China will not want to replace the U.S. And China is not in a position to replace U.S. I think I believe in that because China now is indeed not in a position. If China is in a position, China would and will replace the United States. He's a big power diplomacy. All the China dream is to make China, if not a peer of United States, China would be the most powerful nation in the world. In his China dream, he talked about 2 or 3 stages. By 49, China will be the most powerful global power. And but several issues here are what the Chinese have been talking about the challenge in U.S. There's a assumption that U.S. is in declining, China is in rise. But this situation, maybe before last year was true, but last year has met a turning point. I think 2022, just like 2008 and 2012 will become landmark years to mark some turning points of Chinese foreign policy or Chinese status in the world. 2008, the financial crisis, the Olympic game, everything marked China's rise. And also at that time, given those impressions, US was in trouble, especially during the financial crisis, started from US. 2022, Xi Jinping took power, really launched China as a big power in the world. And 2022, I would think is a mark. of another turning point, that China's rise not only slowed down, but also could, stopped. People talk about China, if China is peaked. I will not know if China's rise is peaked, but at least China's growth would be much slower in the next Xi Jinping's 5 years. So in that situation, I don't think Xi Jinping would be, or China would be in a position to replace the U.S. power, at least in the next 5 years. Whether you can predict China will not overtake U.S. over all economic size in next 10 years or 20 years, but at least in the near future, I don't think that would happen. Then in that case, what would China behave if China would become more aggressive? There's two options here. China could become more aggressive, but also China could make a shift its tone and try to return to more kind of Deng Xiaoping's or Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao's foreign policy. But at this time, I have not seen that happen. Xi's speech at the party school last week or week before still emphasized the China's past, challenged the modernization equal to westernization. China provided a unique path for modernization. All those kind of speeches and the domestic policies he has placed, has still emphasized nationalism. And as I said, he lives in a bubble in China. He may not understand what's going on inside China and outside China. So in that case, I don't know what kind of adventures or mistakes he will make again. And as I said, China entered this vicious cycle. Mao Zedong did the same thing. Before 1957-59, Mao was in a very good position. But since after he made mistake in the Great Leap Forward, he became so defensive. Then he made one after another mistake, eventually launched the Cultural Revolution to destroy the whole country. So I don't know, the zero COVID policy was a big mistake. The U-turn was another big mistake. There's some other mistakes. So when you make those mistakes, you become defensive and you tend to make more mistakes. So I don't know where China will go from here. Sorry, Susan.
Well, we do have a lot more questions. I know this event is supposed to end in 3 minutes, but Professor Zhao, are you able to stay on just a little longer to answer a couple more questions? Okay.
Those are interesting questions.
Thank you. So Jessica Liao has a question. By the way, Philip Chow raised his hand. So maybe Jason can help Philip to, again, if you feel comfortable, you can come on camera. We have a little bit more time.
Jessica Liao just came back from U.S. Embassy in Beijing.
Oh, great. So Jessica said,
still in the mission there.
Thank you for pointing that out. I know, actually, that's a side question, because at the end of the day, we want this talk to help both sides, right? We want a peaceful outcome. No, I think in our camp, people want to try to avoid both sides make blunders. And I'm happy to see Jessica down here. Again, maybe later you can give some insights for both sides to be helpful, right? But Jessica's question is, thank you for the excellent presentation. As you pointed out, the 180-degree change of zero COVID showed the uncertainty of policy under Xi's China, but it also points to the puzzle of this huge country as obviously not simply run by just one man. Also, some recent studies found that many small groups led from the notion of top design are gradually meeting less and less and losing potency of policymaking power. Can you discuss under Xi's China what actors, groups, or factions are potential in making decisive power shifts? Thank you.
And this is a very, very difficult question. I don't think I have answer, and I don't know if those outside of China could have answer at this time. As she mentioned that Xi Jinping has concentrated power and those so-called connective leadership, and consensus building process is completely replaced by what I call the Xi in command model, just like when the scholars study Chinese politics during Mao's time, they use the Mao in command model. That means even Mao, during Mao's time, there was a internal power balance during the entire PRC history. Mao was balanced by his revolutionary comrades, then by Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, some other elders. And Deng Xiaoping was balanced by Chen Yun and those elders. And Jiang Zemin was balanced by Deng Xiaoping. Hu Jintao was balanced by Jiang Zemin. Who is balancing Xi Jinping? Jessica, you mentioned maybe some factional forces, but we don't know. We cannot identify any clear factions now in the Chinese leadership. And as you say, there should be new factions emerging, although Xi eliminated those in the top leadership. But those who he selected could form new factions to compete, to show who was more loyal to him. And also, they are taking chance. If something happened, they will be positioned in a good position to succeed him. I mean, he is almost 70 years old, and I don't know how good his health is. There's a lot of uncertainties, but we don't know. All these things we don't know. But they don't himself said 党内有党，党外有派. There are parties within party. There are factions outside parties. So that's the that's the PRC reality. But we don't know at this time. And just Susan asked about military. I think military is a wild card at this time. He has tightened the control of military, but the military always has its own interests and acted sometimes in a stranger way. I don't know, the balloon thing tells anything, but in the past, he is very alert toward the military. He is, so there are so many issues, players there, I don't know.
Great. While we have Philip Chow here to ask one question, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhao. Thank you for your wonderful presentation, and the way you organized it gave a lot of clarity as to different type of leadership, at least in the Communist Party, not going all the way back 4,000 years. But thank you for that. So there's a lot of discussion about how the future growth of China economically is going to be nothing like the past. I'm not so sure that is such a new thing. I mean, no one, even Chinese, don't believe we're going to have a 10% GDP forever. This is something that is very, very typical of a developing nation, from an emerging market to a developing market over time. And even if China grows at 4%, 4.5%, not 6%, and certainly not 10%, it is still significant for an economy of 1.4 billion people. So I'm challenging this typical statement, which you didn't make, but it was discussed, that it was so horrible that it is going to slow down. I mean, almost China is over when it comes to the economy. I just don't feel that way. I think that's number one. Love to hear your thought on that. Number two, I'm afraid that I'm one of those few people who painstakingly read the 62 pages of summary of the 20th Party Congress, Xi's statement, his speech. And it's quite fascinating, is my understanding. I'd love to hear your thought on that as well. That it actually talks a great deal about what he and the party, primarily him, based on our conversation today, intend to do for China. And we didn't talk about how he feels about common prosperity in the sense of the big socialism with Chinese characteristic, and how he is trying to even out the prosperity from the wealthy Western coastal state provinces all the way across country. to lift this living standard and to provide social fabric. I'm not promoting his speech. I'm merely saying what he says, he recognizes, seems to me, a lot of the issues that people criticize China about, from ecological soundness to really spending more emphasis on middle and small enterprises, where the large enterprises are stymied, let alone being oligopolistic approach to the rise of business and entrepreneurialism. I don't know how much of that is true, but at least it is written, at least it's made public. And I would love to hear your thought that in the last the 19th Party Congress and 18th Party Congress, similar speeches have been given, of course, every time they give a speech. And it seems like they have followed those speeches fairly consistently the way they are going forward. So should we continue to believe the 20th Party Congress statements by Xi is really laying out what the next 5 to 10 years is going to do? And if indeed that is the case, I will push back for a lot of criticism about where China is going, not necessarily Xi, but where China is going, because if you lay out the 62 pages, it seems pretty interesting. And they recognize the shortcoming of some of the things that we're all talking about. Sorry for a very long question. I apologize, but I really, really appreciate the conversation. I really appreciate the sponsorship by the United States Heartland China Association. And thank you for whatever answer you're going to provide.
Yeah, I tried to be brief. Those are really, really difficult and also very, very good questions. The first question, I'm not an economist, so I'm not in position to make an economic forecast. But what I see, I agree with what you said. In the U.S. Understanding of China, there are always kind of swings to two extremes. Only 2 years ago, so many people in the U.S. were talking about China would overtake the U.S. As a larger economy in 5, if not in 10 years. So it seems, and those in China also, Huang Gang, all those people even talk China already became the largest economy, overtook U.S. Not only economically, but also technologically, everything. But now, just several years after, we see the other extreme. In the West now, in Washington, as you said, and people said China is gone, China is no longer a rising economic power. Chinese economy will even not stagnate, would even collapse in the future. Both directions, both arguments, I think, were not accurate. I would say somehow China's economic growth will be in the middle. China will not, as Min Fan or someone already said, no country could maintain, as you said, 10% of economic growth forever. And those type of slowing down is a very normal process. But what China's slowing down, I think, has in a very somehow worrying domestic and international environment. And these and Xi's policy, although we talk about 20th Party Congress had a lot of important points if you read the report, but some of those policies will not help that much for economic growth. And the zero COVID and U-turn and current some of those economic policies, which is a very uncertain economic policies directions, we don't know, makes people worry and concerned. Of course, I agree with you that China will continue as such a huge economy, second largest economy. China would maintain its economic size, and China will not be easily to stagnate or collapse. But China would be in a very much more difficult environment to continue its growth and continue its search for the so-called China dream. Even I think a lot of people in China have recognized. Before the Trump administration, trade war, not Chinese thought their technology was already over the US, but that was a wake-up call for a lot of people. China still relied upon US so much in the technology front. And China's rise, China's aggressive behavior in the last several years really awakened America. And this type of international environment also made China very difficult. The second question you talk about here, the issue I think is that if Xi Jinping is really thinking to make China, make good policies for China, I think definitely as a leader in that position, he definitely wants to make China economic growth and to become the most powerful nation. But in the meantime, his ideology and his another thoughts are somehow not fit or not match what he wants to do. Again, I hate to use the same example, but 3 years of COVID zero, I think it really destroyed, helped. I mean, it's self-destruction, but it took 3 years to correct that. Then the correction was also a disaster process. So that tells you something about his competence, his way to help China's economy and to guide China the future direction. Talking about those statements in the party documents, they are not all look beautiful. But here, what I found Xi's way doing, he launched big projects, but cannot finish them. Xiong'an is a good example. One Belt, One Road, another good. Beijing Stock Exchange. I mean, so many great ideas, but cannot, Chinese are 烂尾工程, just cannot finish. Now he proposed global development initiative, global security initiative, in addition to One Belt, One Road. So a lot of new initiatives. They are good ideas, but how can you accomplish them? That's what we have to see if China can do that.
Okay, well, we went over time, but I want to give everyone, maybe Alan, Jason, a simple question. And then I'll ask one last question and we'll wrap the event. Is that okay, Professor Zhao?
Sure, definitely.
Okay. So Alan, simple question, please.
Simple question. I suppose the most straightforward question would just be, what do you hope that American or Chinese policymakers might gain from your book?
They should understand that China is a big power and rising as a big power. And the China rise would inevitably challenge the international order, challenge US dominance. And so how the US understands, or American officials, government scholars understand China's foreign policy dynamics, and those forces behind these dynamics are very important. And hopefully then they understand each other. But this is try to help the world and the Chinese themselves understand China. And the other side of the coin is that China should also understand the United States. The mutual understanding is very important to avoid those misjudgment, misperception. There are so many misjudgment, misperception, as Min Fan talked about. When you were in China, you went to disaster area, which I think that's a really interesting misperception. So how to understand each other, that's important. Really understand China has long history, long civilization, and China has a trajectory of development.
Thank you. Jason, your quick question?
So on the topic of understanding each other, do you have any positive outlook for 2023 or ways that you expect this year that the US and China can work together?
I don't know. The Bologna event really did not give us a good start for this year. We'll have to see if they can work out during this, Munich meeting. And I really hope Xi Jinping will come to the US in the G20 summit. I think it's the OPEC in Washington, November this year. And these two sides could build momentum. In fact, I hope also Tony Blinken will visit Beijing, China after this meeting. And so that if that happens, we'll have some positive outlook. If they cannot work out, I hope they will not. They will work out. Then we'll be very pessimistic about relationship.
Well, thank you, Professor Zhao, for the excellent lesson discussion, and we really appreciate it. And this will be recorded and will be posted for wider distribution. Thank you again for your time, and thank you for the audience and for joining us tonight. Good night, good day. Thank you.
Organizing this.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.